Hello, everyone. I hope you are happy and healthy and well. Here at the beginning, I wanted to clarify or describe some important terms that are relevant when not only thinking about plays, but just narratives and stories at large, but they're particularly useful when thinking about these kinds of tragedies. But before I do that, I thought I would briefly summarize some of the topics that I want to discuss today. I certainly want to talk about two characters who emerge in today's reading in a significant way. One is Cren, Oedipus's brother-in-law, and the other is Jocasta, Oedipus's wife, and as we learn progressively throughout the play, regrettably his mother as well. Yes, it's a bit weird. But I also want to talk about how the sense of tension and the seeming inevitability of the truth builds and escalates in the reading for today, but coupled with that, how perhaps even the sense of tragedy in this play is increased or augmented, principally because of hubris. And I talked about hubris a bit, I believe, in the last recording, but just to define it here, hubris is perhaps excessive confidence, even arrogance. And often when we think about hubris, we think perhaps about individuals who seemed so sure and so certain of themselves. And perhaps because of that certainty, they did not take potential problems into account or consideration. And you could almost draw or create this link between their hubris and their ultimate demise or their failure. So I certainly want to talk about hubris today and how hubris seems to accentuate or even increase the sense of tragedy in this play. But before I do that, I said I wanted to talk about some terms, some important terms, maybe one or two of them I've mentioned before, but they are three terms when thinking about characters and character designations in stories. The first is protagonist, and you've probably heard this sort of term before. A protagonist is often the main character, or in a superhero film or story, the hero they embody and have certain values that we as the audience like and endorse. And a simple but useful example is to just think about any story with a clear hero and a clear villain. And again, how we think about protagonists matters, especially as it relates to not only what they want, but what motivates them, what ultimately drives them. So again, think about just a simple superhero story. There's the hero on one side and the villain on the other, perhaps, and this happens a lot in superhero stories. The villain wants to destroy the world and the hero wants to save the world. And I would say our endorsement of the hero, or perhaps the protagonist in this situation, it's not just that we agree that someone should save the world, we also often agree with and endorse what motivates characters to, in this situation, want to save the world. We agree with the moral and ethical injunctions that drive and motivate them. Perhaps some of those are simply the want and the need and the desire to prevent death and destruction and chaos. And again, that's a fine but at times simple way to think about protagonists. I wouldn't say it's wrong to think about them in those terms, but often, again, a protagonist is a main character. They're the character who spends the most time, if it's a play, on stage speaking. So in a play like Hamlet, Hamlet is certainly the protagonist. If you are the titular character, or if the play or the story is named after you, that often seems to suggest you're the protagonist. One notable exception in Shakespeare, for example, is Julius Caesar. He is certainly not the protagonist. If anything, maybe Brutus is the protagonist of that play. So that's one notable exception. But Another way to perhaps nuance this understanding of what a protagonist is to then think about, well, what is an antagonist? And again, often an antagonist, in the simplest terms, is the villain or the person who wants to thwart the efforts of the hero. But I said a moment ago that thinking about it in those terms, while that isn't bad, it is a bit simplistic. And here's one way to maybe nuance this designation between antagonist and protagonist. In some stories, the antagonist and the protagonist in many ways want the same thing, but the point of departure for them is not only what motivates them, but also how they want to get it. So, for example, if you're familiar with the comic book series, which I believe became an HBO show, it was also a film directed by Zack Snyder. It's a comic book series called Watchmen, and I won't say too much about it because I don't want to spoil any of the aspects of the story if you're interested, but that is a wonderful story that shows or demonstrates or dramatizes how there's this shifting of how we think about antagonists and protagonists, but also the characters that we would designate as antagonists. It's not that they're these mustache twirling villains in the corner who just want to create chaos. If anything, in a story like Watchmen, the antagonist wants to make the world a better place. They want what often our heroes want, but the antagonist has a fundamentally different, in that story at least, the antagonist has a fundamentally different way of achieving that goal. So again, in really great stories, the distinction between protagonist and antagonist is one of action. So they both want the same thing, but they have a fundamentally different understanding of how to get whatever it is both of them want. And I think that kind of subtlety and that kind of nuance is quite nice and quite interesting and quite smart. Another way of thinking about this is to imagine in really great stories, what if the story, and this doesn't happen a lot, but what if the story was narrated by the antagonist or from the antagonist's point of view? An excellent example of this is a novel called Grendel. And if you've read the story Beowulf or the poem Beowulf, you know that Grendel is one of the main antagonists or villains, but he seems like a simple, plain-dealing villain in that story. And what this novel, it's a contemporary novel, what it does, it ultimately narrates the events of Beowulf from Grendel's perspective. And what that affords us is an opportunity to, again, question how we often define what it means for someone to be a hero or a villain, an antagonist and a protagonist. Another wonderful example of this is a C.S. Lewis novel called The Screwtape Letters. And C.S. Lewis, as some of you might know, was and remains one of the most famous Christian writers of the 20th century, but in the Screwtape Letters, it's a series of letters between two demons, and they're in effect writing about, well, what are the best ways to cause humanity to fail and sin and to condemn them to eternal damnation. And what's interesting, and I mention it only because we often don't hear stories from that perspective, but within the novel itself, anytime these two characters refer to the enemy, they're not, within a kind of Christian matrix, they're not referencing Satan or the devil, they're referencing God. So even those kinds of shifts, when thinking about protagonists and antagonists, while it is to some degree true that the protagonist is the good guy and the antagonist is the bad guy, there are excellent examples in literature of more nuanced takes of those terms and those designations. And again, just in quick summary, remember, in really great stories, both the antagonist and the protagonist ultimately want the same thing. They just have different ways of getting that thing they want, and that's often how we distinguish the two. Now, the other term that I want to introduce is, and it's another character designation, a lot like antagonist and protagonist, it's called the foil or a foil character, Foil. And foil characters are similar to the protagonist. Perhaps they sound at times a bit like the protagonist. They want, broadly speaking, the same sorts of things the protagonist wants, but because they're not the protagonist, they're slightly different. And that's what's important about a foil character is they are similar to the protagonist, but they're different in notable ways. And in Oedipus, one of Oedipus's foils is Creon, because Creon and Oedipus are similar characters in a lot of ways. But it's the differences that Creon embodies in relation to Oedipus that both casts Oedipus as the protagonist, but even Creon as the foil into a fundamentally different light. It's one of those times when doing a bit of compare and contrast work is actually quite revealing and quite insightful, because maybe, and I think this is what happens in Oedipus, it shows or reveals some of the deficiencies in Oedipus, some of the deficiencies in his character. And as we discussed on Monday, it's precisely those deficiencies that may lead Oedipus to fail or might create the conditions for him to fail. So it's with Creon that I want to start this conversation today. And I want to begin on page maybe 1791. And what we see here, Creon, he's appealing to the chorus, and perhaps by extension, he's appealing to us as well. And at the end of that short piece of dialogue, he says, "The report injures me doubly and most vitally, for I'll be called a traitor to my city and traitor also to my friends and you." And just to remind you, Oedipus, we saw some of his perhaps conspiratorial thinking, some of his paranoia in the reading for Monday. And one of the things he suggested was, well, perhaps Creon's conspiring to usurp or take his power. And notice Creon begins this exchange with the chorus, and then it becomes an exchange with Oedipus by suggesting that this report injures him or it hurts his feelings, the idea that he would be a traitor to his city and his friends. And that almost immediately casts Creon in this sympathetic light, where perhaps, and I think Oedipus's behavior only accentuates this, that Creon seems like the more sympathetic and the more reasonable figure. And we see how reasonable Creon seems on the next page. Notice this is around line 610 or 615. Oedipus, he's come in quite hot, as he is wanton to do. And Creon says, "But tell me then of what offense I'm guilty." And I think this is important because Creon, he's perhaps forcing Oedipus to say what it is Oedipus thinks Creon has done. And this is a clever rhetorical tactic because it's Creon, again, forcing Oedipus to speak a conspiracy. And while conspiracy theories are entertaining, it's difficult to take people who seem to almost exclusively only believe conspiracy theories seriously. And there's this sense that Creon is perhaps attempting to position Oedipus in this way. But finally, when Creon speaks on page 1793, when he finally speaks at length, he says something quite interesting. And I want to read directly from the text here. This is on 1793. "Note, if you will reflect on it as I do, consider first if you think anyone would choose to rule in fear rather than rule and sleep untroubled by a fear if power were equal in both cases. I, at least, I was not born with such a frantic yearning to be a king, but to do what kings do. And so it is with everyone who has learned wisdom and self-control. As it stands now, the prizes are all mine, and without fear. But if I were the king myself, I must do much that went against the grain. How should despotic rule seems sweeter to me than painless power and an assured authority. I am not so besotted yet that I want other honors than those that come with profit. Now, every man's my pleasure, every man greets me. Now those who are your suitors fawn on me. Success for them depends upon my favor. Why should I let all this go to win that? My mind would not be traitor if it's wise. And I don't think I'll continue any farther, but Creon says several interesting things here, but maybe more importantly, he asks this larger question, and it's a question about power and control. And if I were to summarize, it sounds something like this. So I'm in a position of influence, but I'm not the king, which you would think to be the king would be preferable, but Creon flips that idea on his head and he says, no, it's perhaps better to be in a position of authority and influence without having all of the responsibilities, the symbolic, perhaps exclusively the symbolic responsibilities of being king. He gets, in many ways, to have the best of both. He's in a position of power and influence without also bearing the responsibility that often comes with being in a position of power and influence. And if you want to think perhaps of a contemporary example, you could think about the Bush administration from 2000 to 2008. Many people argued that George Bush, while he was technically president, he wasn't really in control. It was his vice president, Dick Cheney, who was really in control. And while vice president is certainly different from the role Creon occupies, which is more of an advisor, you can see why people would draw that comparison, or you could see the relevance of that comparison. The point seems to be that by not being the president, by not bearing the symbolic responsibility of being the leader, capital T, capital L, Dick Cheney could do things that he otherwise couldn't do, and he had a kind of mobility and a kind of freedom that presidents, or in this case, the President of the United States, even though the President of the United States is a remarkably powerful person, there's perhaps a kind of freedom and mobility that the president can never have. And I would encourage you to perhaps just meditate over what this line of reasoning and this line of argumentation suggests about Creon. Does this cast Creon into this position where you think, well, he's a rather craven political actor. He's really good at speaking, for example. He knows he's speaking to the public. The chorus is here. It's as if he's addressing them and he's addressing us. So is he taking advantage perhaps of a political opportunity? And while this is not, or this need not be an either or, you could also say, well, sure, he's certainly doing that. He's also making a rather smart and savvy point, and he's offering a compelling critique of power and positions of power, and perhaps how, even though we often defer to whether it's a king, whether it's a president, we often defer to them as the sources of ultimate power. Creon is perhaps challenging us to think that, well, maybe that's not ultimately true. Maybe in too many cases, or too often, it's not the president or the king or the leader, capital T, capital L, who has the most power. Maybe the person who has the most power is the person whispering from a safe position in their ear. And if you're someone who likes Game of Thrones, you might find this point quite compelling in most cases, that it's those advisors or those individuals who occupy an advisory role who seem to be maybe the most powerful and to have the most influence. But from here, we should talk about another new character who enters and really treats Oedipus and Creon like their two children, and that is Jocasta, who is Creon's sister and Oedipus's wife. And Notice what she says when she enters on page 1794, quote, "For shame! Why have you raised this foolish squabbling brawl? Are you not ashamed to air your private griefs when the country's sick? Go in, you Oedipus, and you, Creon, into the house. Don't magnify your nothing troubles." And I think this opening bit of dialogue, it reveals so much about Jocasta and how she thinks and what her priorities ultimately are. First, she sounds a bit like a mother scolding two young children who are fighting over a single toy, but perhaps in a more substantial way, she says, "Why are you doing this in public? Don't do this. This is not the right place to have these sorts of conversations and to have these sorts of debates." And what that ultimately suggests is that Jocasta is someone, and we see this as we continue to read the play, she's someone who almost wants to suppress the truth, whatever that might be. She does not want to shine a magnifying glass, and she doesn't want to search too deeply or too closely for whatever the truth might be. Now, that's not to suggest that Jocasta lacks intelligence, and that's not to suggest that she's a superficial character, but it is to suggest that she's someone who likes to operate with as few eyes watching as possible, which is interesting because Oedipus, again, by contrast, and I think here that contrast is quite clear and quite notable. By contrast, Oedipus is someone who's always making these grand public declarations. Jocasta is not that. She's someone who, if she is maneuvering, she wants to do so quietly, privately. Okay, from here, Jocasta and Oedipus exchange a bit of dialogue, and Jocasta reveals what she ultimately thinks about some ideas that we've discussed because they were presented earlier in the play. Jocasta reveals how she feels about prophecies, oracles, fate, etc. And this is on page 1796, and I'll read almost all of this. It's the last thing she says on that page, but "Do not concern yourself," and here she's speaking to Oedipus, "do not concern yourself about this matter. Listen to me and learn that human beings have no part in the craft of prophecy. Of that I'll show you a short proof. There was an oracle once that came to Laius," and Laius is Oedipus's father. We'll talk about that later, but he's the former king. "It will not say that it was Phoebus's own, but it was from his servants, and it told him that it was fate that he should die a victim at the hands of his own son, a son to be born of Laius and me." So we're learning a little more about this prophecy. "But see now, he the king was killed by foreign highway robbers at a place where three roads met, so goes the story. And for the son, before 3 days were out after his birth, King Laius pierced his ankles, and by the hands of others cast him forth upon a pathless hillside. So Apollo fell to fulfill his oracle to the son, that he should kill his father, and to Laius also proved false, in that the thing he feared, death at his son's hands, never came to pass. So clear in this case were the oracles, so clear and false. Give them no heed, I say. What God discovers need of, easily he shows to us himself." So Jocasta says a few interesting things here. As I said a moment ago, first, we're learning a little more about this prophecy, some more details, but more than anything, it's this final thing she says. It's how she closes this bit of dialogue. She says, quote, give them no heed, I say, what God discovers need of, easily he shows to us himself." And what she's ultimately suggesting here is that if God wants or needs to communicate something to us, God will not do so through these cryptic prophecies and these oracles. God will simply tell us or communicate to us directly. Therefore, it's a waste of time, and it's quite silly to even pay these sorts of prophecy any mind at all, because, again, prophecies are indirect ways of communicating between God or the gods and mankind. And Jocasta says, if God wants to communicate to us, he will do so directly. And I'll leave it to you to decide what to ultimately make of this line of argument and this line of reasoning, because you could suggest, or you could argue, that this is perhaps in contrast to how Oedipus thinks of things. Even the idea that he would dispatch Creon at the beginning of the play to investigate and to question the oracles to know what the gods think of this plague in Thebes might suggest that Oedipus does pay credence to what oracles say and to the sorts of prophecies they deliver. But Jocasta says, no, absolutely not. That is not how things work. And then Oedipus says, and this is something that Sophocles does quite nicely throughout the play, at least from this point moving forward, Oedipus says something that once you arrive at the end of the play, you realize just how tragic and ironic this is. This is later on page 1797 in response to something Jocasta says. He says, "Oh God, I think I have called curses on myself in ignorance." But what's so interesting about this, and again, it's connected to these notions of hubris, it's connected to this sense of tragic irony that really defines this play. This is something that Oedipus seems to acknowledge at times and then forget. And I'm not suggesting that he forgets because he has a clumsy memory. He forces himself to forget it. So this is something he knows, but for him to proceed and for him maybe to even act and exist in this world, he needs to forget it until he's ultimately confronted with the impossibility of forgetting this. Now, from here, let's talk about what Oedipus and Jocasta learn on page 1802. Again, this only perhaps deepens the sense of tragic irony in this play. So Oedipus, he claims to have come from a place called Corinth, and he did, but it's more complicated than that, and I'll talk about this a little more next time. But a messenger arrives, and this messenger communicates he has a message, as messengers do. He communicates to Oedipus and Jocasta that Oedipus's father has died. And for Jocasta, this is important because this seems to suggest that, again, or this confirms that the prophecy that she and Laius were told was completely false. This just confirms what she said a few pages ago. And notice what she says on page 1802. "Be quick and run to the king with the news." And then she almost cannot help herself. There's something almost compulsive about what follows. "O oracles of the gods, where are you now? It was from this man Oedipus fled, lest he should be his murderer, and now he is dead in the course of nature and not killed by Oedipus." And again, this is one of those moments where you almost want to put a pin in this, because what she's saying, it's not correct. This is wrong. The king in Corinth, this was not Oedipus's father. Laius was his father. However, Jocasta doesn't know that, or at least she's convinced herself that she doesn't know that. And Oedipus, you could even argue, doesn't know that, or he's convinced himself that he doesn't know that. But the important thing here is characters making these kinds of totalizing declarations with limited information. But again, the irony is they don't know how limited their information actually is. And Oedipus almost affirms or even repeats or regurgitates this idea later on the page when he's told about what happened. "Oh, dear Jocasta, why should one look to the Pythian hearth? Why should one look to the birds screaming overhead? They prophesied that I should kill my father, but he's dead and hidden deep in the earth. And I stand here who never laid a hand on spear against him, unless perhaps he died of longing for me. And thus I am his murderer, but they, the oracles as they stand, he's taken them away with him. They're dead as he himself is, and worthless." So again, the sense of hubris and arrogance to declare something that Oedipus doesn't know. And again, I guess the point is he doesn't know that he doesn't know that what he's saying is wrong. But Some of my students have made a fair bit of this moment when he interjects in this bit of dialogue and he says, well, maybe I killed my father, and he's being funny, but I think it's revealing. Maybe I killed my father, or maybe I'm responsible for my father's death because he just missed me so much. He died from longing for my presence. But the important thing about this interjection is how, even as Oedipus declares in this moment that he clearly was not responsible for his father's death, through a joke, he is at least creating or opening space where he could acknowledge that maybe he was responsible, which might suggest a kind of unconscious, there's almost something unconscious about this interjection, as if what he was just told is something that he doesn't actually believe. So from here, we learn that Oedipus and Jocasta's relief was or is short-lived, because this messenger reveals on page 1803, and this carries to 1804, he reveals that Polybus, the king of Corinth, the king who presumably just died, Oedipus learns that this person wasn't in fact his father, and this messenger reveals that he was part of this plan to remove Oedipus from Thebes when Laius and Jocasta learned about this prophecy. So notice how the moment, and this is important, this pushing and pulling, notice how the moment when it seems as if the conflict in the narrative ends, that's the moment when the conflict just begins again. So even this sense of unity or harmony that often comes from the resolution of a problem or conflict, it doesn't last long in Greek tragedy. But this messenger has incomplete information, and it should come as no surprise that this provokes Oedipus again into pushing forward, to persisting for the truth. And on page 1805, pay attention to what Jocasta says, and pay attention to how she attempts to dissuade him. Why ask of whom he spoke? Don't give it heed, nor try to keep in mind what has been said. It will be wasted labor. So the question perhaps worth asking here is, well, what does Jocasta know? And what has she perhaps attempted to forget? But what is she ultimately prepared to live with if she's saying what she's saying here? Because just to be as explicit as possible, this seems to suggest that she knows what Oedipus ultimately did, but she is to some degree prepared to suppress this. For what reason? It's difficult to say at this point, but I would encourage you to speculate. Is this because she just wants to maintain a kind of stability in Thebes and within her family? Is this perhaps a continuation of what I talked about earlier in this lecture, that she just wants to keep everything out of the public? She wants to shut the door, so to speak, on whatever the truth might be, especially if it's an inconvenient truth. But notice what Oedipus says ostensibly in response to this. I will not be persuaded to let be the chance of finding out the whole thing clearly, to which Jocasta responds, O Oedipus, God help you, God keep you from the knowledge of who you are. So we're seeing in many ways dialogue that projects how these characters ultimately see themselves, what ultimately drives them, and the sorts of adjectives we might use when describing them ourselves as audience members. Oedipus is defined by this persistence to know the truth, even if it drives him to complete destruction and annihilation, and Jocasta is the complete opposite. So maybe the question worth asking, and we'll continue this, or we'll pick up this question in the next lecture, which of these two characters is behaving in an ethical way? Because if Oedipus learns the truth, it will lead to personal destruction and annihilation, but it will also perhaps thrust Thebes into a more chaotic, unstable, and insecure place. But it will reveal the truth. And what Jocasta, what her response seems to suggest is that for there to be real and persistent security, that means we must live with certain uncomfortable truths. But for the good of the polis, or for the good of the people, for the good of the community, we must suppress those truths. There are some things that cannot be spoken, some things that cannot be said, even if they are the truth. So I would just encourage you to think about which of these two characters embodies the most ethical position, or is it possible that one is behaving ethically and one is behaving in a rather unethical way? So I think that's where I'll leave it for today. Again, a lot of the things we discussed in the last lecture, they're becoming a lot clearer now. I think we're starting to see in ways that Oedipus couldn't what the ultimate truth is, even as he's still rejecting and possibly ignoring this truth. And it's worth introducing one final term here at the end. I've mentioned irony before, but there are different types and different sorts of irony. Of course, there's just verbal irony. Think of any of you who might ask me, or who might have asked me, how's your day? And if I wanted to be ironic, I might say something like, oh, it's great, which there's something about how my tone and what I'm ultimately saying, they don't agree with one another. So that's verbal irony. But then there's dramatic irony, which that's exactly what we're seeing here. And dramatic irony is simply when we, the audience, knows more, or when we, the audience, know what characters in a story don't know or don't fully know. So this play, it really hinges on the deployment of dramatic irony, again, where we as the audience are maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead of the characters in the story. And this is a type of irony that horror films deploy often. Think, for example, about any time when you see the villain or the monster with a knife or a weapon, and then it cuts to someone or even 2 people who are about to enter the house. And we know something. We almost exist in this privileged place where we know more than what they know. And if you're someone who watches horror movies like I do, you're probably shouting at the screen, don't go in, don't go in. But it's precisely that kind of tension that really makes the story work. So we see, even though this is a different genre, we see Sophocles deploying dramatic irony in the same way that directors and writers in horror films do. Hey everyone, Colin here. So I'm hopping in just to clarify that I am incorporating 2 separate audio lectures into this one audio lecture as a way of just making it as easy to listen to as possible. In the past, when I've taught this play, I've taught it over 3 course periods instead of over 2 weeks in this online format. So that's what really necessitates this combining of 2 different lectures. So here in just a moment, I'll stop talking, but then you'll hear me again. And that's why if this transition feels a little stilted and forced, it's because I'm combining 2 pieces of audio here just for listenability. So I hope that makes sense. And if you have any questions, please contact me. And with this third piece, these final 10 pages or so, we're really left to just watch or to bear witness to Oedipus finally acknowledging what we for quite some time have known is the truth for what a character like Jocasta, recognizing what for a character like Jocasta she has known, it seems, for, my goodness, a number of years. And because of that, and this is something that we discussed in the short fiction unit, how all great narratives and all great stories build through conflict, and that moment when the conflict is at its peak, that moment when a resolution of some kind needs to happen. Once that resolution actually happens, once the sense of conflict that ties or tethers the narrative together is broken, everything from there is a bit anticlimactic and a bit boring and tedious. A great example is, and I think I mentioned the very first Star Wars film at some point this semester, but that moment when Luke destroys the Death Star in Episode 4, you would certainly be forgiven for thinking that the rest of the movie is not necessarily that interesting, because the main source of conflict in that narrative, the threat that the Death Star poses, once that threat is removed, or once our heroes vanquish that threat, the rest of the narrative is frankly quite perfunctory and not that interesting. And Oedipus is quite similar in that way. And we actually begin this lecture's reading with Oedipus again pushing for the truth, while in perhaps a contradictory way, knowing that by doing so, he's ultimately creating the conditions or pushing himself and the narrative to a place that will cause and create an immense amount of destruction, pain, and chaos. But like we've done with the previous two lectures, I think it's interesting to pause for a moment and assess how Oedipus sounds, seems, and feels here at the beginning of the reading for this week. And I think the thing you'll notice is that all of those threats of violence and all of the impatience and hastiness that seems to define Oedipus's character, we're certainly seeing it flourish in a way here that maybe we haven't seen to this point. Maybe you could argue some of his behavior toward Creon was a step in this direction, so to speak. But I'm on page 1807, and here he's speaking to this herdsman. And just to remind you, so there was this messenger from really just a page or two before 1807 who in effect said to Oedipus, and he delivered this message to Oedipus that his father, and you should use air quotes when saying his father, the king of Corinth, he delivered a message that his father, the king of Corinth, had died. And for Oedipus and Jocasta, for a moment, they were quite ecstatic, because they thought this meant that all of those prophecies that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother were in fact false. But the messenger quickly disabuses them of this and says, no, there was this child, and this child, a herdsman or a shepherd, gave him to me, and I think it's you, to be quite frank. And Oedipus now wants to speak to and interrogate this herdsman or this shepherd to, again, learn what he seems to already know. And again, I think it is interesting how, for someone like Oedipus, just knowing the truth isn't enough, or acting on what I think all of us would agree is seemingly impeachable evidence that he is in fact the curse that plagues Thebes, that he has done, unbeknownst to him of course, all of these atrocious things. But this way that he's pushing, we talked about this, or I talked about this on the first day, this persistence defines Oedipus's character in fascinating ways. And maybe you can argue some of this threatening of violence towards the herdsman is just a projection, again, of what would otherwise be an extremely laudable personality trait or characteristic like persistence. This is perhaps an aspect of it, when that trait is no longer a benefit, but it's actually a hindrance or a defect. And this is what Oedipus says. Well, first I'll start with the herdsman. O best of masters, how do I give offense? To which Oedipus replies, when you refuse to speak about the child of whom he asks you. To which the herdsman replies, he speaks out of his ignorance without meaning. To which Oedipus then replies, if you'll not talk to gratify me, you will talk with pain to urge you. And then we see that Oedipus, one or two lines later, says, here one of you twist his hands behind him. To which the herdsman replies, why, God help me, why? What do you want to know? And of course, Oedipus replies, you gave a child to him, the child he asked you of. And eventually the herdsman confirms that it was in fact Oedipus, that he has in fact done all of these atrocious things that the prophecy said he would do. And I think the point here for us as audience members, again, it's something quite pitiful, perhaps, and this is one of the questions I'll ask you to consider, is how do you feel about Oedipus here at the end of the play? Because he has pushed this point about as far as it could possibly go. And I don't know if because of this insistence to eliminate every possible counter narrative, I don't know how that makes you feel about Oedipus. Now, I can say something about how I think Sophocles wants us to feel, and I think this is, again, connected to something I talked about on the first day, this idea of what it means for a tragedy to be a tragedy, and what it means for someone to be a tragic hero or a tragic figure. It's this recognition of someone like Oedipus, a king who has a reputation for saving his city and caring about his city. And not because this person breaks bad or anything, not because he just decides to become a villain, but perhaps, again, ironically enough, because he pushes so hard and he takes what would otherwise be a laudable characteristic and perverts it in some way. Through doing that, he falls. He falls about as far as someone could fall. And notice this isn't a small or a short fall. This is someone who was at the very top, falling to the bottom and maybe even a bit beyond the bottom, whatever that might be. And notice what the herdsman says on 1808, and this is after everything was said. O master, and he's speaking specifically about Oedipus here, O master, I pitied it, and thought that I could send it off to another country, and this man was from another country, but he saved it from the most terrible troubles. If you are the man he says you are, you're bred to misery. So even notice here what the herdsman says. I think this is important. All of this chaos, all of this terror, and all of this tragedy, it emerges not because there were one or even a small collection of bad actors, or maybe not even because the world is a bad place necessarily, although if that's something you're thinking about, I would encourage you to tease that out. But it's perhaps because, again, ironically enough, one individual made a single choice, and that single choice was to take pity on a child. And from that one act, from that one choice, all of this seemed to happen. And notice how the herdsman finishes this line of dialogue. If you are the man he says you are, you're bred to misery. And that's such an interesting line, because I think you could do some rather smart analytical work. What does that mean to be bred to misery, because one of the ideas that I introduced at the beginning of this play was, well, to what degree does Oedipus have agency? To what degree can he actually make choices? And, or perhaps by contrast, to what degree is he simply destined to do what an oracle or the oracles or the gods or whomever have suggested, or even in the gods' case, decided he would do? Is Oedipus simply an actor on a stage reading lines, and he despite what he may or may not know, he doesn't actually have any choice, or he doesn't have any agency? Or does he actually have choice and agency? Because what the herdsman seems to say here suggests that he thinks Oedipus regrettably didn't seem to have any choices, or didn't seem to have choice or agency. And that's perhaps one way of reading this. You're bred to it, as if to say, perhaps you came from it. You were brought into this world with misery attached to you, like a sin or a stain that, despite your best efforts, you could never possibly cleanse yourself of. And again, in that way, despite some of the awful choices Oedipus has made in this play, I wonder if that might change or shift your feelings about this character. Do you think of him as someone who perhaps, because he didn't have the ability to choose in the way that most of us would like to think we do, he while he made mistakes, maybe he's not fully responsible for those mistakes, and perhaps that makes him, for you, a tragic figure? Or perhaps you think, no, all of this, Oedipus, he it's only, again, ironically enough, by attempting to defy these proclamations from the gods that he created the conditions for his own demise. Maybe you could even go as far as to say, if only he didn't think himself so arrogant, or if he wasn't so arrogant as to think that his actions and his actions alone could defy the will of the gods, then perhaps this wouldn't have happened. And my goodness, even from there, you could then conclude, well, this is a punishment of sorts for this thought, or this idea, this suggestion that he could defy the will of the gods, even as ambiguous as that will was. It is, quite frankly, a bit confusing, but that's part of what makes a play like this so compelling. It invites us perhaps to consider how blurred that line is between free will and fate, and whether you're someone who believes or not that there's a powerful deity making decisions and choices, you can certainly understand and acknowledge how even your ability to make choices that positively affect and impact your life, they are in many ways contingent on things beyond your control. I think we're, for example, doing this different sort of educational delivery system, if I wanted to be generous and call it that, simply because there are and were people who made choices that were and are beyond our control as singular individuals. So in many ways, Oedipus is a play that grapples with those sorts of ideas, because we often, and we've talked about this before this semester, we often like to think that we are singularly responsible for the conditions of our lives, and our ability to choose and make choices is a mark or a signifier of our freedom. But Oedipus is a play that really reminds us that we're far more connected than we would perhaps even want to think, because what that seems to mean or suggest is that our ability to make singular choices, or our ability to think of ourselves as wholly and unambiguously free, well, it's just not that simple. Now, regarding how we might think about Oedipus, I've mentioned before the way the chorus thinks about Oedipus is worth our time and worth our consideration. So notice what the chorus says on page 1809. And this is the strophe part or portion. But now whose tale is more miserable? Who is there lives with a savager fate, whose troubles so reverse his life as his? O Oedipus, the famous prince, for whom a great haven, the same both as father and son, sufficed for generation, how, oh how, have the furrows plowed by your father endured to bear you, poor wretch, and hold their peace so long? To which the antistrophe responds, Time, who sees all, has found you out against your will, judges your marriage accursed, begetter and begot at one in it. O child of Laius, would I had never seen you! I weep for you, and cry a dirge of lamentation. To speak directly, I drew my breath from you at the first, and so now I lull my mouth to sleep with your name. So even here, just hearing the chorus say quite explicitly, O child of Oedipus, would I had never seen you, I weep for you, and cry a dirge of lamentation, which is to suggest that the chorus seems to take a fair amount of pity on Oedipus. Oedipus is, according to the chorus, the most pitiful thing they've ever seen or heard. So again, allow that to influence your reading of Oedipus how you will. Now, from here, again, things unravel in a way that only deepens the sense of grotesque tragedy. We learn, we don't see this on stage, but it's reported to us that Jocasta has committed suicide for reasons that we perhaps seem to understand, considering how she left us near the end of the reading for the second day. And Oedipus, in a rather symbolically relevant and significant way, has literally blinded himself. And this is something that students always enjoy discussing. What does this ultimately mean? And there's a couple of potential readings. I think the most obvious is that this is Oedipus finally reconciling himself to what he is and what he's perhaps always been, which is blind in some way. So he's perhaps self-actualizing what he's always been. Another possible reading is that, and this is perhaps a more generous reading of Oedipus as a character, that he because, and again, now perhaps I'm thinking back, or I'm encouraging you to think back to the blind prophet from, or the blind oracle from the beginning of the play, Tiresias, how he was blind, and that lack of actual sight allowed him or permitted him to, in effect, have wisdom in some way, if you want to imagine. And this is something, if you like, for example, Norse mythology, you may know that Odin, or Odin's son, he allowed himself to lose an eye as a way of gaining wisdom, or gaining a kind of sight he didn't have before, maybe something better than just actual physical sight. And with Oedipus, we're seeing something potentially similar here, that what he's ultimately suggesting by this blinding gesture is that he is now a figure who is far wiser than he was before. He understands things better that he, in theory, could not have understood before, or he seems to think he could not have understood it before because of the, again, ironically enough, the limitations of physical sight. And from here, the play ends with the chorus reaffirming that Oedipus has perhaps become a social outcast of some kind. This is on page 1811. I shudder at the sight of you. And even earlier in that bit of dialogue, and I think this is important, I made mention of this earlier, this is a terrible sight for men to see. I never found a worse. And I would argue one of the things that Sophocles seems interested in exploring is how we must, as the audience, and again thinking of the chorus as a proxy for the audience, we must in some way bear witness to this. This is something, and I'll leave it to you to decide why, but this is something that must be seen. And there is something quite brutal and even unrelenting about that kind of idea, that there are some things that cannot be hidden. There are some things we cannot selectively edit out or edit around. There are some things that we must see in all of its brutality and all of its horror. And if you're someone who likes a show like Twin Peaks, I would argue there are times when that show has a similar orientation to some of the horrors and the brutalities of this world. There are some things that we, again, simply cannot edit around. We must see it, we must show it, we must expose it, and we as the audience are left, unfortunately, to bear witness to it. But the idea of Oedipus becoming a social outcast is significant because scholars have written about societal and cultural scapegoating rituals, and they've used a play like Oedipus as an example of this. And a scapegoating ritual is quite simply when a society or a culture takes all of its sin and all of its transgressions, and it symbolically transfers it onto a single individual and then thrusts or casts them out as a way of cleansing the culture or the society in question. If you want to think of this in biblical terms, even what happens with Jesus if you just exclude some of the Christian particulars, which maybe someone wouldn't want to do that. But for the purposes of this illustration, if you exclude the Christian particulars, what's ultimately happening in a moment like that is Jesus is assuming the sins and the transgressions of mankind, and he must die for that very reason. So he becomes that scapegoat in a lot of ways. And Oedipus too functions as something of a scapegoat figure. He's for the city, for Thebes to be cleansed. It's not enough to just identify who is in theory the source of the sin and the transgression. And I think this is what's ultimately interesting. It typically doesn't matter whether the scapegoated figure did something wrong or not. The point is someone's been chosen, someone's been identified. And in this case, Oedipus did do, in theory, the awful thing or the awful things that have caused the city of Thebes to quite literally rot. But often you'll see that that's not the case. The point is we must heap these collective sins and these collective transgressions onto this single figure. And that might also help to explain why Oedipus cannot simply just die, but he needs to leave. He needs to be excluded in some way, because it's not just enough for him to die. He needs to almost carry the burden of this collective, communal, societal sin or transgression, which that might, especially if you look at the end of the play, that might, again, cast Oedipus in a decidedly heroic light, or that might allow you to think of Oedipus in a far more favorable way. Notice, for example, what he says on 1815. Yet I know this much, no sickness and no other thing will kill me. I would not have been saved from death if not for some strange evil fate. Well, let my fate go where it will. And I think what you see here is this clear movement or this evolution in Oedipus's character, because at the beginning of the play, I don't necessarily know, and I think you see this throughout the play as well, he is not someone who seems satisfied, obviously, with his fate as it exists. But here at the end of the play, the message he seems to communicate is that he is someone who has now accepted what fate has decreed for him instead of attempting to defy fate. And again, perhaps this is a way of casting Oedipus as a wiser figure, a more mature figure. I'll leave it to you to ultimately decide what you think. But that is certainly an interesting change or shift in his character. Now, the play ends, and you'll notice that Creon in particular wants Oedipus to not do what he said he would do. And I think it's interesting that in theory, Oedipus's last act as king is to banish himself. And by doing so, again, he is no longer the king. So maybe there's a bit of irony there. But Oedipus holds firm to this. And once again, we're seeing Oedipus as a character or a figure who will not negotiate. He could easily enough do that. And I think there are countless examples in the 20th and even the 21st century of weak-willed leaders making these strong decrees, and then when they are potentially subject to the punishment of those decrees, finding ways to, well, weasel out of it. I think someone like Nixon is an interesting example. Not that he pardoned himself, but his successor, Ford, certainly did. But he was someone who was in a position of power. He abused his position of power, and he ultimately wasn't punished, at least not in an official capacity, aside from, of course, losing or resigning the presidency. But back to Oedipus. Oedipus here, you'll notice, unlike some of those leaders that we could imagine, or unlike some of those influential figures, Oedipus is quite persistent that this is what needs to happen, this is what he decreed would happen, and this is what will happen. So maybe here at the end, one way you can think about Oedipus is to think of this gesture as something of an ethical act, because he is willing to invite a kind of self-destruction, chaos, and annihilation, but for a particular principle. And he will not negotiate away from that principle. That principle is as unmovable and as persistent as he seemed throughout the entire play. So in that way, Oedipus has remained a rather consistent character. But I think maybe the point here, or the idea that I would invite you to consider, is that what we're seeing here at the end is what Oedipus's persistence looks like when it's channeled in a positive way. But notice this only happens, or this he only arrives at this, ironically enough, through the tragedy and the horrors of complete self-annihilation, because that is literally what happens, but it's also what happens on a figurative, a metaphoric, and a symbolic level for him. Again, considering how he's fallen, he embodied, symbolically speaking, a position of authority, maybe the position of authority. And what we're seeing here is a fall like we don't often see. So I think that's all I'll say about Oedipus. A rather brutal and unrelenting play, but it's one that you can certainly write about, and you'll have opportunities to do so. And I'm interested to know what you think about the play ultimately. So I'm looking forward to if you choose to write about Oedipus, your essays about it.